This episode is supported in part by Sacred Wright's public scholarship on religion, gender, and sexuality through a grant from the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation. You can find Sacred Wrights online at sacred-rights.org and the Carpenter Foundation at carpenterfoundation.us. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. Welcome to Season 9 of Conversations featuring cohort members from Sacred Wrights. Since 2020, I have loved discussing the diverse array of research conducted and produced by Sacred Wrights scholars. Playlists to the previous 8 seasons are included in the link tree in the episode notes. My guest on this episode is Dr. Dana Lloyd. Dr. Dana Lloyd is Assistant Professor of Global Interdisciplinary Studies and affiliated faculty at the Center for Peace and Justice Education at Villanova University. She is the author of Land is Kin, Sovereignty, Religious Freedom, and Indigenous Sacred Sites from the University Press of Kansas, and the co-editor of American Examples, A New Conversation About Religion, Volume 3 from the University of Alabama Press. A scholar of law and religion, Lloyd is now writing about how law and religion construct mothers and motherhood through an interplay between ideas about care and neglect. She is a co-PI for the research project Critical Perspectives on Care, Social Reproduction Theory in a Global Context. We discuss the book at length in this episode and then preview a bit of her forthcoming projects. Thank you so much for listening. Dr. Dana Lloyd, welcome to Classical Ideas.
It's great to be here. Hi, Greg.
I'm delighted that you're here. I'm wondering if we can kick this off by having you just introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners so they know who you are and what you do.
I am Dana Lloyd, as you said. I write about law and humanities, I guess for our purposes, law and religion specifically. I teach at Villanova University. And I am I'm not in a religion department. I'm in a global interdisciplinary department where I get to teach courses about feminist theory, indigenous theory. I'm affiliated with the Center for Peace and Justice Education, so that's also really fun.
I want to know a little bit about how you found yourself on that path. How did you get interested in religion, law, humanities? Take me a little bit through that academic life story, if you will, just to kind of set the stage for your specific work that we're going to talk about in a few minutes.
Yeah, I grew up in Tel Aviv, and I think I always knew, like since I was maybe 8, that I will be a lawyer. And in the Israeli system follows the British system, so you do law school as an undergrad, which is what I did. I hated it from the first moment. But being my mother's daughter, I finished and I clerked for a judge and I did the bar exams and all that. But at the same time, I think I just tried to take as many classes outside of the law school as I could and fell in love with continental philosophy, especially philosophy of religion, I guess. And so when it was time to go to grad school, I knew 2 things. One is that the US would be the place to go because of language issues and because of funding structures. And I knew that if you want to do continental philosophy, you probably shouldn't do it in a philosophy department, but other places like religion departments, comparative literature, English, right? You can do continental philosophy. And so I found myself in a religion department at Syracuse University for a PhD program. When I was there, it was clear that my legal background came with me. I'll stop with that, but that's how law and religion. I discovered it as a field as well, and found a nice spot in it. So,
how did you land on your specific topic in grad school for your dissertation? Because that's what I'm curious about next, because it's going to kind of lead into your book talk.
Well, the real story is that in my first semester, we did theories and methods class where each professor came a different week to introduce a different theory and method in religious studies. And the person who became my advisor, Phil Arnold, came one week and he talked about just Johnson v. McIntosh, which is the U.S. Supreme Court that founded Indian federal law. And I think that I, without even intending to, said, this sounds like a decision that could have been handed down in the Supreme Court in Jerusalem today.
Mm.
And he said, you have to write about that. And it took me some years to come back to this comment and say, yeah, that's what I need to do. But it ended up, what I did for my dissertation, and which is now a book.
Land is Kin, out 2024 from the University of Kansas Press. So a very recent publication. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Tell me a little bit about the origin of the dissertation process, translating it into this book. Tell me about how the book starts to come together for you.
Yeah, so it started as a dissertation, and I think that my original idea was to look at different legal cases where indigenous land is a protagonist, but also where religion, especially in the form of religious freedom, right? But maybe not necessarily at that point, figures significantly. And then one of the cases at which I looked just in a way chose me, like it haunted me so much that the dissertation became a project that's about one legal case. It's a case that originated in a trial that lasted 2 weeks, which is really long for a trial. And it means that the transcripts are thousands of pages. And the other thing to say about this case, Ling v. Northwest Indian Cemetery Protective Association from 1988, is that it's a case that I think every law student in their first year in constitutional law, they read it or a version of it. There's hundreds and hundreds of law review articles about it. None of it looks at the materials from the trial, the evidence, everything around the case. It's just, dissecting there are two opinions in the case. There's a majority opinion and a dissent, and reading those very closely in many, many, many scholarly works. And I wanted to know more, right? So I did find all these materials in some archives, both the testimony and the evidence in the case, which told a much bigger story, right? And so my dissertation is just analysis of legal documents, legal theory. Talk more about what I do there. But after I finished, and once I got a postdoc and had more money, I was also able to actually go to Northern California, where the sacred place in the center of this case is. And since it's a case from the 80s, some of the people who were central to the litigation and the activism around it are still around. And so I was able to meet them and talk to them and get their blessing, right? Like to write about this. There's a complicated history, right, of white scholars studying
For sure.
Native peoples, right? So I wouldn't have done that without approval, I guess, right? From Yurok, Karuk, Tolowa people who are again, we can talk a little bit more about the substance of the case, but the book is much larger than me reading legal documents, even though I'm not an anthropologist, and what I did I don't think of as field work.
Yeah, let's talk about the nations involved. Said Yurok, Karuk, and Tolowa nations. Who are these tribes, and what do we need to know?
The place at the center of this case and of the book is in the middle of Karuk homeland. It's true that the Yurok nation, Tolowa nation, and Hupa nation are also. It's also sacred to them. They also live in the same and around the same area. We're talking about Northern California. So the place that they call the High Country is managed by the U.S. Government as the Six Rivers National Forest along the Klamath River. So that's the California-Oregon border. And these are people who have not been relocated. A lot of indigenous peoples in the U.S. and around the world live on lands that are not their ancestral lands. And in this case, we're talking about people who have been in this place since, I guess, how they would say, time immemorial, right? So
Sure.
I think that's really significant also to thinking about this place.
What was the relationship building for you like as the writer and the researcher? You mentioned the problematic nature possibly that pops up, but the introduction to your book is written by a judge in the region, I believe, who is a member of one of these nations. So tell me about that relationship building aspect.
So yeah, so I had a dissertation that was based only on legal documents, right? And of course a lot of scholarship, but had no people in it. And it took me some time to find connections with these people. California Indian Legal Services, where was the organization that litigated the case. So I contacted them. It took months and months until they came back to me, but they put me in touch with Chief Judge Abby Abinanti, who's a Yurok tribal court chief judge, and I emailed her and I sent her the dissertation, and she immediately said, "Come visit, come see the court, come see what we're doing here." She was really, really nice. Introduced me to some other people whom, I felt like I knew them intimately because I've read all their testimonies and things that they published, and knew a lot about the work that they've been doing over decades, right? And so being able to contact them and then be welcomed by them was really, really, really cool. So the relationship building, I came, it was, I think, 2019 when I first went to Yurok country, and I visited the tribal court and met a lot of good people who told me a lot, both about the history. I came wanting to know about this case, right? About the legal case and the history of its litigation and the activism. But also, once you're there, you end up knowing a lot of other things about that are more contemporary, and you make friendships. I was planning to come back, but then pandemic hit and I couldn't travel. So I was scheduled to go there in April 2020.
Very
Can you
terrible
imagine?
timing.
Yes, this trip did not happen, but I was able, then I was home and said, at least let me do some work with you if I can, right? Like grant writing, whatever that I can do for you while I'm writing this book from a distance. So I was able to maintain this relationship from afar. Again, I'm not an anthropologist, so I didn't feel like I have to be in the field in order to do the research and write the book.
I want to know a little bit about the high country specifically. You mentioned that it's up near the California-Oregon state line. Is there a particular reason why it's called the high country?
Well, I guess two reasons. One is that it is a place of high elevation. It has these rocks that are called prayer seats: Doctor Rock, Chimney Rock, Peak 8, Elk Valley, sacred prayer spots where medicine people come to do trainings, where sacred plants and medicine is gathered. All sorts of ceremonies are taking place there. And so I think that the name high country comes both from this like physical elevation, but also from the sacredness, right? Because it has this high power in this place.
In your introduction chapter to the book, it says that there are various reasons why people go there. Women go there for certain purposes. Medicine men go there for certain purposes. Men go there for certain purposes. Tell me a little bit about the variety of purposes that this region serves.
Yeah, I'd say, I guess maybe two main purposes that I will mention is one is that I already mentioned is the training of medicine people who are religious leaders, who would go, well, both to train and also if there is a ceremony that they're going to run, they would go to the high country beforehand to gather the medicine that they need, right? To get the power that they need in order to perform the ceremony, which would be outside of this sacred area, right? Like the other reason that people go is that when they get a calling, so someone has a problem, and people, even in the during the trial, the witnesses mention all sorts of personal stories. Someone says his son was in a really bad car accident, and all the doctors that he saw said he's going to die. Like there's no way that he can survive. And then he got a calling from the creator telling him to go to the high country. And he went, and he says, during the trial, he says, that was, remember, 20 years ago, my son is still alive. And so one of the things that come up in the trial is that the place is not very accessible. And what the government wants to do is to develop, quote unquote, develop the high country. So cut down a lot of the trees there, build a road that would support the logging industry. And so part of what both the lawyers and the judge are asking, well, do you want to make the place more accessible? You get a calling, maybe you can't go, right? If it's in the middle of winter, maybe you can't access it. And the witnesses' response is striking to me, right? They say, yeah, maybe I can't access it and maybe people will die, but this is the point. It shouldn't be accessible, right? And it definitely shouldn't be accessible to people who are not called to go there, whether indigenous or not.
Earlier, you mentioned Ling versus Northwest Indian Cemetery Protective Association. So the book does a great job of tracing some land rights issues. I read about some examples in the 70s and the 80s. Tell me a little bit about the history of this development in the region that kind of sets the stage for the Supreme Court cases that come later on.
Yeah. So again, the high country is a forest area. It has these sacred rocks. It has these ancient tall trees. It is not very accessible. Medicine people go there. Yurok Karuk people are saying we've been using this place for religious purposes for thousands of years. Around the 1950s, the Forest Service, and again, this is not part of any reservation. It's a national forest, right? Six Rivers National Forest. And so maybe national parks are there to be preserved. National forests are there to be developed. That's the purpose. And the Forest Service wants to develop this area. Especially what they want is to cut down a lot of the trees. They have a plan to do it over 80 years. And for that, they start building this road that would allow trucks to come in, right? To make the place accessible to the logging industry. And so there's decades of indigenous activism against this development, and all sorts of administrative appeals against it.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing helps. Eventually, they go to court, right? One thing that the Forest Service also does is that there is, in 1978, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act is enacted, and one thing that it requires is a consultation process. So when the government wants to do anything to an area of cultural significance to indigenous peoples, they have to go through consultation. The thing that the law does not do is that it doesn't tell the government that it has to follow up on whatever the consultation results in, right? So the Forest Service does go through the consultation process, which produces a 500-page report that has some anthropology, some history, some archaeology, and the bottom line is, don't touch this area. There's no way you can build this road that would not harm the religious practice of these people.
Mm-hmm.
The Forest Service, check the box of consultation and says, we're going to do it anyway. And so the tribes go to court. They win in the first two lower courts, and the government takes them to the Supreme Court, and there the tribes lose. And so my entry point is that the dispute, by the time the case is at the Supreme Court, the dispute is over the final 6 miles of this logging road. It's called the Go Road because it was supposed to connect two towns, Gasquet and Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
And the Supreme Court gets requests to hear maybe 700 cases a year, and it takes maybe 10% of those cases. And it was really strange to me that they agreed to hear a case that's about 6 miles in the middle of a forest. How can it be significant enough, to win over all these other cases? And then my other question was like, how come they lost such a case? Like, how could it be? And this is going more into the argument of the book. But what I realized at some point was that even though all the scholarship that I read about Ling is about religious freedom, maybe there are other theoretical frameworks that are more helpful in order to answer these questions. And so I got into all this, into indigenous studies theory, and specifically into questions of sovereignty. And that was really helpful, both in interpreting what I read from the evidence and the testimony in the case, and reading the decision itself.
I want to know a little bit about the title as well. So in the book, you talk about land, and then you have it as some topic, right? So you have land as home, land as property, land as sacred, land as wild, land as kin. And it's almost like a ladder to me, like where I'm seeing something that on the bottom is, like the property stuff and like a physical house. And then you get a little bit more intensely connected to the natural world the higher up you go. That's just kind of how I read it. I'm curious if you can tell me a little bit about this this sort of land as something stratification that you have laid out here in the introduction.
This is actually a beautiful reading. Thank you for that. So when you just read the Supreme Court decision in the case, it looks as if, some indigenous people are going into court and saying this place is sacred to us. We have the right of religious freedom right from the Constitution, from this American Indian Religious Freedom Act that I mentioned. And the court says, we believe you, that this is, what the law requires is for the plaintiffs to prove that this is a sincerely held belief, and that the harm that will be done to their religious belief is indeed, very significant. The court says, yeah, you proved that, but this is government property, so I can't help you. Go to the legislature. Can't do anything about it. And so it looks as if what we have is a competition between the right to religious freedom and the right to property. And knowing American politics, right, property always is going to win.
Yes.
If this is the competition. But when you take a step back and you read more materials and you listen more carefully to the people involved, what I saw was that land actually played other roles as well. It wasn't only either sacred or property. It was also, people were talking about it as homeland, wilderness. We didn't talk about it at all, but the place, I guess that's the spoiler, the high country eventually has been protected through the Wilderness Act. So
great.
So that road was never built. The trees were never cut. And so the idea of land is wild also plays a really important role in this case. And then for me, the way I finish with land is kin actually moves beyond the Ling case and looks at developments in the area later on, very recently, specifically legal battles around the Klamath River. I think one significant thing that happened since, the 80s is that the Yurok people realized that the federal courts will not give them any significant remedy. And so that's not the sphere that's not the front where they want to hold their struggle, right? And they do have their tribal court and an elaborate tribal government. And so in 2019, they issued a resolution called the Klamath River Resolution, where they say they recognize the Klamath River as a rights-bearing person, which means that it has standing in court and the right to remedy. And even more significantly, the Yurok Tribal Court would have jurisdiction over cases where, you harm the river in some way, pollution, damming, all that. We would not take you to federal courts. We would take you to Yurok Tribal Court. And when you read the UROC constitution and how the lawyers who wrote this resolution talk about it, what they say is that the river is their relative and they have an obligation to protect it. It's not at all about their right to use it, to use water, to use land, to commodify it, right?
Yeah.
And so this notion of kinship was very powerful and I think applies to the high country as well. And I think also ultimately is capacious enough to include all the other conceptions of land that we see in at least my reading of this case, right? So land doesn't have to be either sacred or property. It can be both, and it can be other things as well.
Yeah. I love it. It really means a lot to me because I did a lot of place-based education in my master's degree program when I lived in Saskatchewan, and it really reframed the way that I think about land in general that I'm like walking on, and it made me a little more cognizant of what the land that my sidewalk is paved over, what that land used to mean or currently does to people that came before me. You know what I mean? And so it just, I think about these things once in a while. And if I let myself go too far down that rabbit hole of thinking about it too much, I go into an existential crisis about like the meaning of like the land and the places that we all inhabit. So your book, it did not send me down an existential crisis, but it made me, it reminded me of times in the past whenever I have started to consider that those things matter a lot. And how I should be a little more appreciative of some of the places that I just take for granted all the time. Well, I love the book, Land as Kin, from the subtitle, Sovereignty, Religious Freedom, and Indigenous Sacred Sites from the University Press of Kansas. You're also part of a Sacred Rights Public Scholarship cohort. So tell me a little bit about your importance, like what you see as the importance of being a publicly facing scholar in the world. Like, why are you interested in doing trainings like this and getting out into the world in a little bit more of a public facing way?
Yeah, I mean, I guess two things come to mind in response to this question. One is the selfish one, which is when I have to talk to people who are not specialists, I have to think clearly and write clearly and speak clearly, and that helps me develop my own thinking, right? Like I have to be accountable to the people with whom I'm talking, and so I can't use jargon in order to hide places where I'm not necessarily understanding all the way. So that's one part of it. The other is that at some point you realize that you know some things, and these things are important, and they shouldn't be only accessible to the 5 people who might buy and read your book. And so finding other kind of outlets seems really significant. I don't know. I mean,
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, like, if I think about people who listen to this podcast from California or Oregon who might hear this and not know anything about the Ling versus Northwest Indian Cemetery Protective Association Supreme Court decision from 1988, and they're like, wow, that's only a couple hours from here. You know what I mean? You never know how talking about something is going to connect with somebody. You never know. What are some of your goals in public scholarship for the future in your work?
the book that I'm writing now is about motherhood.
Ooh, wonderful. Read that. Tell me about it.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So it's really at the beginning stages, but thinking about how law and also religion actually construct motherhood through an interplay between ideas about care and neglect. So if you look at legal cases that are about mothers, what kind of ideas are at play there? And then looking at different areas, right, like sex discrimination of mothers at work, adoption and foster care, surrogacy, immigration, all sorts of areas, right? But centering around mothers. And I guess especially in the current political climate, um, I think speaking publicly about gender is going to be huge for me, and not only for me. So I think bringing this project into more public facing venues would be my next goal.
I feel exactly the same way. I think that the fact that I have this little area on this podcast where I can platform people who talk about things that matter in this current political climate specifically, I feel very lucky that I've carved out this little place where I can allow people to speak freely on a lot of work that matters, that is being downplayed and challenged directly by the current administration's policy decisions and future goals. So it makes me really happy that you wanted to do that here and chat about it a little bit. Do you see anything with regards to like the risks and the rewards and responsibilities of being a publicly facing scholar with regards to your future? How do you see those three R's?
I think the first time that I've been getting pushback around my more public-facing work was in the past year and a half or so. At Villanova, I've been part of a group of faculty and students and staff organizing around justice in Palestine, and we've been doing teachings every month and supporting the students who are more active than us faculty, actually. And that's the first time that I started, receiving like hate mail. And the Zionist trolls woke up and found me. My specific positionality makes me feel relatively safe in the face of it. I don't think I can be accused of anti-Semitism, but probably before that, I would have laughed if you said, what are the risks? I don't have risks, I'm a white woman. This all changed, but
the campus climates for the last year and a half or so have been very fascinating to watch unfold in general. So thank you for sharing that experience as well.
I'll say I'm very lucky to be at Villanova, actually. Like that it is a great place to be, watching, outward and seeing other campuses. I have a beautiful community, and the administration is supportive, and it is a much better place to be than other campuses. So just have to mention that.
Well, that's great. Well, Dr. Dana Lloyd, I hope that people have enjoyed your overview of Land is Kin, Sovereignty, Religious Freedom, and Indigenous Sacred Sites from University of Kansas Press. People can find you in the links to the Sacred Rights cohort that I've included in the show notes. Is there anywhere else you'd like to direct people's attention if you wanted to, get them to follow along with some of the work that you're doing?
Well, I guess one exciting project that I'm working on now, along with a couple colleagues, Surti Singh from Villanova and Yeta Mulai from Toronto Metropolitan University, is it's a project about care and theories of care from the Global South. And we have a speakers series that is running now virtually, and we have a website that I can send to you, but it is cpcsymposium.com, where people can go on and register and attend the talks. And there's a reading group that we're doing as well. Hopefully a book coming out of it. So that's the most exciting thing that I'm doing now.
Wonderful. Well, I will definitely link the Critical Perspectives on Care, Social Reproduction Theory in a Global Context project in the show notes as well. Dr. Dana Lloyd, thank you so much for spending some time with me to chat about your work on classical ideas.
Thank you. That was really fun.